Friends of the Dark Secret community, welcome tonight. We usually provide on-screen warnings, but this time it's necessary for you to listen. The story you're about to hear is considered very intense due to the horrifying, and above all, heart-wrenching events that occurred. I know that many little ones listen to us in the company of their families. Tonight, my dear friends, this broadcast is not for you. Soon, a new story will be released that you can share with the adults in the house. On the other hand, if you are already an adult, I recommend the utmost discretion. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, you can return when you regain your composure or feel calmer. But before you leave me, please don't forget to give me a thumbs up, comment on what you thought, and if you haven't already, subscribe and activate the notification bell. That would help us a lot. This is not a joke. If you don't like to talk about death, especially when it involves children, come back later. I will always be here with open arms. You are listening to Dark Secret.
Are you ready for this?
Child Embalmer. Many people don't understand why someone would work in a funeral home, cemetery, or anything related to the deceased. However, the answer is simple: someone has to do it. When you add the possibility of making money to the equation, it confirms that there are a vast number of people willing to engage in activities involving corpses. Besides, let's be honest, the death business is a niche that never lacks customers. I decided with a clear conscience to dedicate myself to the embalming of the deceased, not because it occurred to me one day, but because of two events that marked my existence brutally. First, one of my uncles got involved with the wrong people. At first, he thought his actions would be just a story to tell his children. However, criminals don't forget. One day, they waited for him on the avenue and took him to an empty area where they beat him relentlessly, then struck him with machetes and left him bleeding to death. I was 7 years old, and I wasn't allowed to see the newspapers where the news and photographs were published. Strangely, after the records were filed and the corresponding legal procedures were carried out, I was able to see my uncle resting peacefully in a navy blue casket with golden frills. Even at that young age, I was aware that his death had been terrible, and I imagined that he would look horrifying. However, I was also curious, so I approached the casket slowly, swallowed hard, and peered inside. The man, barely 28 years old, looked as if he were asleep. His face was slightly swollen, but there were no visible scratches to reveal the terrible things his enemies had done to him. No one would have guessed that he had misbehaved in his life, and that's why other criminals had taken it upon themselves to remove him from their path. I remember asking my mom if that was really my uncle, and she said yes. Then, I questioned how they had removed the machete wounds, and she burst into tears. So my dad took me to the garden and explained, there's a man who specializes in preparing those who pass away in complicated ways so that they look good, meaning they appear just as their family members knew them and don't have an unpleasant image before they are buried. Learning that filled me with astonishment, and I felt like I had just discovered a world that I had known nothing about until then. When I asked how they did it, my father said, they use makeup and some products to conceal anything that would make the deceased look bad. They also clean them and use certain substances so that the sad memory of their last moments isn't even more difficult for the people who love them. The last thing I asked was, what's that man called? Dad replied, an embalmer. I never forgot that word, although I still hadn't decided that I would dedicate myself to that. It would be 3 more years before I made that determination. When I turned 10, while I was studying 4th grade in elementary school, I became friends with Joaquim, a studious but restless boy with whom I got along very well. One Friday after school, just a few days before the end of the school year, he and some other classmates started playing soccer outside the school, and the ball flew onto the street. In an act of heroism, Joaquim volunteered to retrieve the ball and ran towards the corner, where the ball had landed. As he picked it up, his body became small enough for a driver who was turning onto the street not to see him and unfortunately ran him over. We all heard the impact and a painful scream. The woman stopped immediately, but it was already too late. Joaquim's body was partially twisted in the wrong direction, and his face was covered in reddish liquid. He no longer breathed. That afternoon, I went into shock and hardly remember anything. I don't know if I slept or spent the night staring at the ceiling. The next day, a funeral was held, and his mother's tears never stopped. The entire class attended to bid him farewell, and while some of us wanted to see him, his relatives kept the white casket completely closed. Since Joaquin was my close friend, I went to the cemetery with my parents to bid him farewell. There, his mother opened the casket and kissed his forehead. The sight was shocking. My always smiling friend had a twisted jaw, and his teeth protruded like a horse's. His eyelid was torn, and as a result, his eye seemed like it might pop out. His skin had a purple hue, and there were many scrapes with dried blood. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't my companion. He looked like a mistreated mannequin, too old to be used further. I turned to my parents and burst into tears. As I regained my composure, Joaquin was buried. Later, at home, I asked my father why my friend hadn't been taken to an embalmer, and he said he didn't know. Maybe his parents never thought of it, or they didn't know about that profession. But then he added, perhaps they couldn't find someone willing to work with such a battered body. It took years for me to truly understand that statement. Despite the circumstances, and with the support of a child psychologist, I managed to finish elementary school and enter middle school. There were no significant incidents at that educational level, but in high school, a pivotal event occurred in my life. When they asked us which university we wanted to attend, I said any university that offered a program in embalming. I had never said it out loud before, but I had been planning it for a long time. My family immediately opposed the idea. They said they had hoped for a promising future for me, as my grades were outstanding, but I couldn't envision myself as a lawyer, architect, or engineer. I proposed trying medicine if their opinion was strongly against my first choice, and I also pointed out that it wouldn't make me entirely happy. In the end, they relented, understood, and supported me. That's how I traveled from the state of Mexico to Mexico City to train as a professional embalmer. I know few people would imagine it, but there are two paths to become one. One involves an embalmer sharing their knowledge with you as if it were an apprenticeship, and the other requires completing a series of courses, including pathology, anatomy, restoration techniques, physiology, funeral laws, and various aesthetic considerations. Before finishing my studies, I did my social service at a funeral home, where they recognized my talent for restoration and hired me as a permanent employee. As soon as I obtained my degree, I dedicated myself to my work with passion and sensitivity. My primary goal was to make people appear as if they were peacefully asleep. Regardless of the terrible deaths they may have experienced, I used wax, makeup, and every available resource to ensure that their loved ones saw them during the funeral and held their serene, calm faces as their last memory. They would be ready to go to a place where pain and death would never afflict them again. Of course, I must confess that it was not easy, and it became even more complicated as word of the funeral home's work spread. While we continued to serve regular cases, the number of restoration requests multiplied. I had to deal with victims of accidents, whose skulls were like intricate puzzles. We also received the bodies of people who had hanged themselves, so I repaired the purple skin of their faces, the red marks on their necks, and stapled their swollen tongues to hide the horror of their passing. These successful restorations, which I dedicated to the memory of my friend Joaquin, reached the ears of many people, including Minerva, a representative of a non-governmental organization dedicated to advocating for children's rights and the eradication of violence against them. Unfortunately, as they rescued one child from a hostile environment, they often had to arrange the burial of another whose life had ended too soon. This is where the funeral home where I worked came into play. They arranged a special rate in exchange for publicity, and we began to attend the somber funerals of children who deserved so much more than a beautiful casket. As a result of this, without realizing it, I ended up becoming a child embalmer, and I handled some cases that would leave many people breathless. I remember, above all, Wendy, a little girl who was just 7 years old when we took her in at the beginning of the year. She passed away on December 31st in a public hospital, but before that, she endured a situation that no one should ever have to face. Her own family used her in a ritual to summon a year of abundance. Minerva handed me a file, and I read with horror the things they had done to her. The representative of the NGO told me they found out about everything because a neighbor couldn't bear to hear the girl's screams and called the police. A patrol car arrived and interrupted the gruesome acts, arresting those responsible and rescuing Wendy, who, though incomprehensible, was still alive. Of course, her tiny body couldn't withstand so many atrocities or cling to a life that should have been long and filled with happiness. I immediately wondered how parents could harm their daughter in that way. However, Minerva revealed to me an extensive chain of crimes perpetrated by those involved, as well as behaviors that bordered on the pathological. They called themselves Satanists, she added, clenching her fists, but they themselves are devils. The father was confined several times in a psychiatric hospital, while her mother had a diagnosis of borderline personality. Although the scenario was alarming, as the orphanages were full of children, the authority wasted time postponing the little girl's recovery. After a few minutes of solemn silence, the woman shared a photo of Wendy during her lifetime to serve as a guide during the restoration and left to continue attending to the judicial matters of this horrific atrocity. As soon as she left, I analyzed the file. The photos contained in the file were crude. However, when I opened the black bag, I felt my heart sink. The small corpse was cut in an inhuman way. As I could see, they cut off his little hands from the wrists and also his feet from the ankles. Then they cauterized them with fire to stop the bleeding, so the sight was terrifying. The report said that her mother confessed to having used her hands to ask the devil that no one could take what belonged to her, and she offered her childish feet to hide her steps from the enemies she had around her. Not satisfied with that, they used the tender eyes of her daughter with the idea of blinding those who looked for them with the aim of harming them. According to her beliefs, they could pass in front of their rivals and would not be able to see them. Finally, they cut out the creature's tongue and threw it into a bonfire where they asked the underworld to punish anyone who spoke ill of them. After their arrest, a police officer asked the parents if they regretted their actions, but instead of asking for forgiveness, they were furious because they were not allowed to continue with their ritual. "Nothing is going to happen to us," was what they claimed. According to what Minerva said, the paramedics had a hard time picking Wendy up, but they did everything possible to save her. She died minutes before arriving at the hospital, and it may be a terrible thought, but what life did she have in store for her if she survived what she suffered? That's why I drained the fluids from her body with infinite dedication. I carefully filled in her eyelids and applied light makeup, just enough to hide the bruises on her face. I put on her a long dress, full of flounces, that had escarole on the sleeves, with the purpose of hiding the lack of her limbs. When I finished my work, I saw in the casket an angel asleep. The photos of her funeral filled the front pages of the newspapers. It was beyond human comprehension that such a beautiful girl had been attacked in that way. That case haunted my dreams for many nights. I had horrendous nightmares where I was the person being tortured by the parents. However, I never forgot that my hands allowed her to leave with dignity. I imagined her spirit smiling, thanking me, and moving on to a better place, a scene that helped me overcome her memory. In the following months, I continued with my work. It's always easier to prepare older people who have had a long life and passed away peacefully, with their families surrounding them, holding their hands. But in this world, death arrives in various ways and at any age, like in the case of Rogelio. He had no reason to die, yet the end of the road came unexpectedly. After returning from kindergarten and entering his house, a piece of the gate came loose due to wear and tear and fell on him. He had just turned 4 years old. The impact of so many pounds of steel caused instant death and shattered the entire right side of his face, chest, and abdomen. The ambulance personnel could do nothing when they arrived at the scene, except assist the parents with paperwork and recommend the funeral home where I was still working. We received the child in the morning, and I set to work covering the cracks in his skin before applying makeup to conceal the purple discoloration caused by the impact. From the beginning, I noticed that the little boy's eyes were open, and they were constantly emitting a fluid, as if they were tears. I tried to close his eyelids, but after a while, they would open again. Later, I applied some glue, but to my surprise, it didn't work. I decided to finish the arrangement that way and then contemplated using staples to seal them permanently. However, something felt strange, so I asked for Don Gerardo's opinion, my boss. Don Gerardo, a man in his mid-60s, belonged to the 4th generation running the funeral home. After hearing my doubt, He picked up the phone and called Rogelio's parents, who arrived an hour later with haggard faces. "You have to say goodbye to your child," Don Gerardo told them. "He won't close his eyes because things happened too quickly, and he doesn't understand what happened." After a bout of crying, the man and the woman entered the morgue and approached their son. Since I had already repaired the damage, both of them were surprised and thanked me, saying he seemed to be in the middle of a tantrum, like those times when he would stare at the ceiling without speaking to them. After that, his father began to talk to him. "Hello, son, my boy. I know you're going through something strange, something that scares you as much as it scares us, but don't be afraid. Mom and Dad are here. I promise you won't be alone. You need to go to a beautiful place, look for it around you. Go on, Rogelio, walk towards it, and don't look back. It might take us a little while, but we'll catch up to you when the time is right. For now, go where you need to go, rest, and don't worry about anything." A lump formed in my throat, and it was hard for me to hold back tears. The mother couldn't speak right away. She cried for a while before gathering the courage to whisper, "Rog, my love, something very sad happened. We don't understand it right now, but please, feel at peace. We're here, you're not alone, and although being apart is difficult for us, it's necessary for you to continue your journey. Do you remember when I had to go to Grandma's because she was sick? You asked me how we could bridge the distance, and I told you that no matter the miles, our hearts would always find a way to come together. It's going to be the same this time. Wherever you are, wherever you go, your soul and mine will remain together because I am your mom, and you are. You are the most precious thing in my life." The woman broke into uncontrollable sobs and took a long time to regain her composure, but her husband patiently held her, and eventually she continued, "My child, don't worry about us, we'll be fine. You can go in peace. This won't diminish our love for you, on the contrary, we love you to infinity." They then closed their son's eyelids and told me, "Thank you, he looks like he's peacefully asleep." That was the last time we had to close Rogelio's eyes. His funeral went smoothly and left me with an inexplicable lesson, one of those insights passed from person to person in this business because books don't cover the strange secrets that death holds. For me, every person who comes to the table where I work is invaluable. I never see them as mere corpses, but as beings deserving of respect and a dignified farewell. However, that doesn't mean it's easy to restore disfigured faces or reconstruct bodies to hide the horror of their final moments. Working with the deceased, in general, is complicated because you can get used to handling lifeless bodies, but in the atmosphere of a morgue, there often prevails a strange, eerie atmosphere predisposed to fear and abnormal events. Occasionally, the doors of the refrigerators open. Lights flicker, go off, or turn on. Things fall or topple over. We hear footsteps or unintelligible voices, and, on occasion, we've even seen silhouettes, mists, and shadows that appear for a second, making us doubt our own sanity. Nevertheless, criminologists, forensic scientists, pathologists, restorers, and other professionals in the field understand that energy works in unknown ways. Perhaps we are only witnessing the effect of the energy that the deceased retained within their bodies, and upon its release, it can deceive our senses influenced by so many urban legends. Regardless, there are anecdotes that border on the unbelievable, and I would categorize them as false if they hadn't happened to me. Personally, I've seen corpses move their hands, legs, heads, or even exhibit an erection. These are the famous post-mortem movements, which occur due to gases generated after death, as well as the response of nerves and tendons to the process of dying. However, I have to mention Nicholas, a 6-year-old boy who died of asphyxiation. His parents brought him in for a makeup service, requesting that we hide the purple discoloration caused by a piece of cookie stuck in his throat. They admitted the child in the afternoon, and the makeup would be done the next morning, so we placed him on the table to drain the necessary fluids before putting him in the refrigerator. For some reason, my assistant stepped out for a few minutes, leaving me alone in the room. I don't know what happened, but I started to feel very cold, and I even saw my breath when I exhaled. Then, I heard a metallic squeak coming from the table where the cadaver was covered by a sheet. Later, I saw movement under the fabric. I immediately thought it was a classic post-mortem spasm, but something compelled me to keep my gaze fixed. Several seconds passed. I felt a tremendous unease, and my mind begged for it not to move again, but, of course, my plea went unanswered. The sheet moved as if someone had blown air from underneath it, and then it rose, pushed up by the entire torso. The child slowly sat up, and once he was upright, the fabric slid from his head to his feet. My heart was racing uncontrollably. My brain couldn't comprehend how this had happened, as no spasm is strong enough to sit up a corpse. Yet, I was witnessing it at that moment. I could have done anything, but I was paralyzed. I couldn't even take my eyes off the boy. I only saw his tousled hair, his purple, almost black, face, and his swollen lips. I expected him to turn towards me, to open his oxygen-deprived, red-rimmed eyes and let out a terrifying scream, or to start moving clumsily, reaching out to harm me. But that didn't happen. He remained there, motionless, like any other dead person. Shortly after, my assistant returned, opened the door, and uttered a curse when he saw the child sitting up. He looked at me and cursed 2 or 3 more times, then he walked to the table and laid the boy down as a father would before bedtime. We used the draining machines and placed him in the refrigerator as quickly as possible. His makeup was applied early, and his body was laid to rest in the local cemetery before sunset. Today, I know that my job isn't the most exciting or well-paying in the world, but I am aware that my efforts help ease the suffering of the deceased's family a little and allow me to honor my friend Joaquin. That's why, if I have to be strong and face cases as gruesome as Wendy's, I will do it with all the courage in the universe. If bad people like my uncle could leave with such a peaceful image, then good people deserve it even more, especially when it comes to innocent souls like those of children. This story has been researched and written for Oscuro Secreto by A. Garcia.